I'm going to go ahead and get right into it. Again, my name is Ken Rosendahl. I'm a park naturalist at Gulf Branch Nature Center. I'm not at Gulf Branch right now, but we're going to get started. And again, one more reminder, I will be recording this, or I am recording this. So if you don't want to show up in the video, you can go ahead and turn your camera off, and please keep your mic off unless you're going to catch me up with a question. I do have no problem with being asked a question at the time. I'm not able to really do a good job of following the chat while I'm presenting. So you can certainly put a question in the chat and I'll come back to it at the end. But if you have a question that you would like to answer or have me answer, go ahead and ask it in the moment. Just kind of catch my attention. That way we don't have to go back and we don't miss the moment especially if if the question is good at that moment. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And we'll get started. That's not there's the share my screen. We're gonna every time I look at it, it's just the screen. Let's make it so different. Is everybody able to hear me?
Yep.
Yep. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Janet, if you're having difficulty, maybe like sign off and sign back in. And see if that corrects the problem. Sorry. When I have computer problems, I hate when someone's like, turn it off and turn it on. I know, but okay, let me get started here. So we're gonna talk about urban birds. I really enjoy birding, so I was really excited to do this presentation. And what I really want to kind of focus on is some of the birds that are really, really very good at exploiting essentially the environments that we create. You know, this isn't really a natural environment. You can just see by this one here, this is a Gravelly Point. That's the parking lot. So lots of pavement, lots of space here that cannot be grown upon. You don't have a lot of stuff. You don't have a lot of vegetation. You have some, but there's a lot of birds that can still take advantage of these environments. They can learn from us and what we do, so they can find food. They can use the places that we create still as shelter. So they do a really good job of exploiting these environments to be successful. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. I figured it's as good as anything. Just pull out the old Merriam-Webster and look at the definition of urban, which is of or relating to cities and the people who live in them. And so we're going to be talking about birds that are really closely associated to us. This is actually northern mockingbird sitting on a light on another part of Gravelly Point. A lot of good opportunities for urban bird pictures in that park. When I'm talking about urban birds, what I really want to do is I want to show you a couple of abundance maps. So these are generated by eBird. And that means if you are using eBird as a means of creating a bird list, like if you go out birding and you use eBird to keep track of all the birds and you submit this, it is going into a giant database of data that researchers can use to track where these birds are spotted. This is a fantastic community science project that's been going on for years, and you've had and I know people like I went back in and did a few, but I know people that went back and put in like decades worth of bird lists, and so they've got some really, really good data about where these birds have been seen, where they're being spotted, timing. These are static abundance maps, but they also have animated migration maps, which I've used in a couple of other PowerPoints, and they're just absolutely phenomenal. So I'm a big fan of it. But to give you an example of what an abundance map is going to look like for a bird, for an urban bird, this is the rock pigeon. We're going to zoom in a little bit here. I edited it some, but you can see there's a lot of spottiness. Like there's not a lot here. Hopefully you can see my cursor here. I'm trying to circle the area where the appellations are. You can see there's not a lot going on there. But in some of these areas where you've got civic centers, where you got city centers or population centers for humans, there's these really dark purple spots. It's really, really abundant there. Some of this can certainly be explained as a I'm blanking on the word I want, as an artifact of that's where people bird. Like maybe there's more people taking or doing checklists in the city as opposed to others, but it's also, the bird doesn't get checked on the list unless it's there. And so you can see it's really spotty. It's not a really smooth distribution map. You could say that you can find these birds from Ontario, and I forget which province this is, sorry, Canada, in Maine, all the way through down the mid-Atlantic states and across into the the prairie in the Midwest and up into southern Canada over here above Montana and North Dakota, but you can see that there are some big gaps there where you're not going to find pigeons. There's not the right kind of habitat. Now let's take a look at a bird like the northern cardinal, which is in roughly the same area. You can see that is a much more filled in map. Like this is a bird that's not just tied to humans. And so you can see it's got a similar abundance in a lot of these areas, but it's just pretty much a pretty flat, straight shot of purple. And I would guess that a lot of these areas where it's a little lighter are simply areas where there's not as much birding being done, because cardinals do pretty well in urban areas and in suburbs too. And you can see they're a little spotty here in the Appalachians as well. So, but that's the difference here. This is a bird that's much more tied to a human presence, and here's a bird that's a native bird that has a pretty regular abundance in most of our eastern forested areas. And again, you see that abundance kind of peters out right here, and this is going into some desert type areas there. So you still see them in some of these Great Plains areas, but in this portion of like Colorado, I remember from living there, there's a lot of desert out here in the plains, and so you don't get them as much there. Um, I lived in Denver for 2 years and remember coming back east and being like, oh, cardinals, it's wonderful. So another example, if we want to compare something that's a little closer to apples, these are house sparrows, even though they're really old world finches. Whoops. But you can see the house sparrow again, that spotty distribution there, a lot of distribution around urban centers and areas where there's a lot of people. You can see it's pretty dark here though in some of these areas where there's a lot of farming, and they are grain eaters. And I think you saw that a little bit with the pigeons as well. But in a lot of these areas around here, really tied to where human areas are. And you see these darker spots around um, uh, people-centered areas like cities and communities. And then if you look at the white-throated sparrow, again, a much smoother, flatter distribution in that the it's not all spotty. There's just pretty much a blue coloration all throughout the range here. This is their non-breeding season. These are the ones we're going to be start seeing now. They go, oh sweet, or Old Sam, Peabody, Peabody, Peabody. I always say, oh, sweet Canada, but Old Sam, Peabody, Peabody, Peabody. And I've heard them now for a couple of weeks, so they're definitely back. And these are one of our really abundant winter birds. And these are sparrows that are, again, also not tied to humans. They're not really linked into urban areas. They are field and forest species you'll see pretty abundantly in the winter. And then this red up here up top is where they're at during the breeding season. But they are with us now. We're getting a lot of our winter birds coming in. I didn't take this from anywhere. These are just three of the things that I feel like I read constantly when you talk about any organism that lives in an urban environment, but especially animals, especially larger, complex animals. The birds, the mammals, reptiles, amphibians. When you talk about an urban environment, they're typically animals that are intelligent. They have a higher intelligence than some others because they can be adaptable. They can be opportunistic, including with their eating. They're not very picky. They can exploit a lot of different types of food, and they're able to adapt to the environment. They're able to find the shelter that they need. They're able to still nest, or raise young, and take advantage of that. I remember reading stories about raccoons that would use sewers in some of the bigger cities. They'd go into a grate and come out, 3 blocks over because they'd use that sewer to travel, and they were avoiding cars and confrontations with people. And then, if you're nocturnal, that also helps because we're out mostly during the day, and so you're going to have less conflict with people at night. And so I didn't add that there, but that kind of is part of adapting to the environment. When there's less of us out, and you're an organism that's out, that's really helpful. And so flying squirrels can be really common in city areas because they're a nocturnal animal that's not out much during the day. So I'm gonna take a second to look at these a little more closely. Intelligence is one of my favorite buddies here from Warner Brothers, but intelligence is really important. And this image from an old Warner Brothers cartoon is really indicative of what people used to think of birds, because bird brain is one of those insults, and I still hear it thrown around occasionally. I think it's a little old as far as being used, but it's out there, and it's not a nice thing to say, and it actually probably should be, because there's a lot of birds that are pretty intelligent. Um, this is a nice scan of a woodpecker. And you can see they've kind of colored in and worked on the scan to show the brain, but the brain size in proportion to the head is really large. And again, they don't have a big head, but for what's in there, they got a pretty good sized brain. Some birds have really, really good, um, they're really real well developed portions of the brain that deal with identifying sound, or creating sound, and visual as well. And some, the tactile and the olfactory are not really well done at all. But something like a vulture, they have a really good olfactory. But generally, birds are not stupid. They can be really, really intelligent. And there's some really interesting um, examples of this. But again, this is a woodpecker. I do want to show, because it's one of my favorite things. If you can see my um, arrow here on the tongue, this is the tongue, and you can see the muscles that are connected that wrap all the way around the head. I just couldn't avoid pointing that out because it's a really neat image to show that. But let's talk about intelligence. This is Archaeopteryx, which is one of those quote unquote links between dinosaurs and birds. And what was interesting is they've done some recent research and found excuse me, found that these dinosaurs that were feathered already had the equipment they needed, the hardwiring in their brain to be able to fly. And even if they weren't able to, or they weren't ready, that um ability, that intelligence they needed in their brain was already there and ready to go. So when they did start flying, when we did have early birds, and as they developed through the process of evolution, that was already there in the species. And so it's been there for a while. And again, um I know people have a hard time walking or even driving, and seeing birds fly, and they're adding essentially an extra dimension into movement, because you're not just moving forward and backward, side and side, you're also going up and down. It takes a certain amount of intelligence, and then the additional stimulus that comes in, where some birds are really good at sensing thermals, and so they can sense those wind movements, so they can take advantage of them, and encircle and soar up high, and stay riding them throughout a warm day. That takes a certain kind of intelligence. Maybe it's not do quadratic equation intelligence, or understand humor intelligence, or write a novel intelligence, but it's an intelligence that's really important, and it helps these birds. So birds are not foolish or stupid animals. This is really interesting. This is something I've always kind of marveled at, that this is uh, uh, somebody was writing about how in um, China, where they would use, and I think China certainly, but Asia, parts of Asia as well, where they would use cormorants to fish. That one of the regular practices was every eighth fish the cormorant would get to eat. And so they'd put the ring around the bird's necks, that birds would go in, fish, and come out and bring back the fish. And once they got their seventh fish, then the ring would come off, and they could go get their own fish to eat. And if the ring was not removed right away, the birds would get sullen, they would get non-compliant. They would not go in and fish, because they knew the next fish was mine. And that seemed to indicate that they could count at least as high as seven. I've caught this many fish, and the next one is mine, and I'm not going in until you take the ring off. And so that's pretty impressive. Again, birds are not very big brains. They don't have a massive amount of headspace up there, but they do use what they have. And counting is a really interesting idea, if that's in fact true. Here's a bunch of ravens hanging out with the big bear. There's a lot of evidence that ravens will often find, especially if they find something that's died, that is not a predator kill. There are several reports I've read where the ravens will find something larger, like a bear or a wolf pack, and lead them to the kill, or to the dead animal, so that they will then open it up. Because if the ravens, which have a pretty big beak, but if they're not able to open it themselves, they will bring a larger predator there. The predator gets a meal out of it, and the ravens just hang out and wait for the predator to be full, and then they come in and eat what's left over. And so I think there's a lot of classic examples of that kind of scavenger following predator examples from, like, Africa, which, when I was growing up, that's where, all the cool nature programs showed stuff in Africa. But, that happens all around the world with different types of predators and scavengers. And ravens are one of these, where, if they find something that they want to eat that they can't open themselves, they'll find somebody to do it for it. And one of the examples I read was actually a researcher who was out researching ravens, and this raven kept coming landing in front of him and then like hopping away as if trying to convince him to follow. And when he followed it, the raven led him to a deer that had died, that hadn't been killed by a predator. And so the raven wasn't able to open it and was hoping if it brought this big critter to it that it would open up that deer, so then the raven itself could get some food later on. So that's not just a action and a reaction. That is a couple levels of a couple of steps of thinking, that you don't find in a lot of other critters. And again, there are birds that use tools. This is a woodpecker finch from the Galapagos. Hopefully on the left, you can see that it's got a little stick here. It's kind of hard to see against the leg, but on the right, it successfully got a grub. That these woodpecker finches will use sticks to poke into crevices to get bugs out. And there are some crows that have been shown to use tools as well. So birds have the intelligence needed to live in urban areas. Certainly some birds do. Opportunistic eaters. I think the classic example of finding food in an area where a lot of people are is bird feeders. But that's food we're putting out, and those birds are just reacting to food that they're more than happy to eat. But you'll find that several species of birds can do quite well with whatever is left behind, as far as eating. I even read a report of where someone was talking about how the birds would fly into through the openings into subway stations to eat food that was being spilled and left behind there, and then they would fly back out later on, so they didn't stay there the whole time, but they knew to go in there because there are people in there and people make a mess. And again, any garbage can, not very safe. When I lived in Cleveland, in the house I rented with a couple of friends, I remember you couldn't put, I think Thursday was our trash day, and you couldn't put that trash out too early because the crows would get in and just tear it apart. And it's just like they seem to know, like Thursday was just a day where there's a lot of crows. Whether they could time it or they were just waiting to see all the bags come out, but on those days the crows were all over it, and it was a pretty big it was a pretty big problem. It was really annoying cleaning up after those birds. And then, of course, adapting to the environment. I think most people have some kind of example of, seeing a bird nest in some places. Robins don't seem to be very picky. This is a robin nest on, oh, I can't remember where this one is. I think it's one of the nature centers I worked at, but I can't remember if this is Reston or if this was out in the Denver area. Um, I have a picture of one that nested on top of an outdoor light that was next to the garage at a place where we were renting when I was living in Colorado too. Robins aren't very picky, and usually they're one of the more common nests that people find. Um, to me, barn swallows is always one of the ones I think of. These are birds that typically choose a human-made structure to nest on, under. And again, if you look at that nest composure there, all these little mounds, these are all mouthfuls of mud. One mouthful at a time, these adults build these nests, which they then put their most precious things in, these eggs, and eventually the youngsters that hatch here. And these guys are pretty close to fledging and leaving the nest here. These are really late in the season young barn swallows. They're just about ready to go. You can see, in fact, there's all this poop hanging out of the nest here. So they've been there for a while, and they're almost in their adult plumage at that point. One of their cousins here, whoops, stop doing that. One of their cousins is the cliff swallow. Same deal here. You can see all the little mouthfuls, the little small mounds of mud in the big mound. And there's a whole little like tunnel entrance here, but these are cliff swallows. This was a garage in again out in Denver on the east side, and each of the corrugations where it went up, there was a nest. There was big corrugations. So you have a nest here, and then you have a nest here, and a nest here. There must have been well over 100 nests in this spot. It was really cool. I'm absolutely certain that they were not happy, whoever owned that garage, because it was right next to a really nice, let's say posh shopping area. When you were having these big mounds of bird poop underneath some of these nests. But it was a fantastic place to go for birding. There was, hundreds of these birds out hunting for bugs, and then they all come in and go in and come back out. So it's one of my favorite spots. We do have something similar out here. I don't know that we don't have those numbers, but this is the underside of the Teddy Roosevelt island bridge that goes from the parking area on the Arlington side of the Potomac. There's that footbridge that goes over to the island. That's the access point, and underneath it, in addition to all these tiny little mud wasp homes, you can see these are all mud dauber wasps of several different types. Right here above the red arrow is a cliff swallow, and there's one of the cliff swallows. I think this guy was on its way out. But there's several of those underneath as well. You don't have to go off trail and look under the uh, bridge to see them unless you want to see the nest. But just hanging out on the bridge in May or June, you can usually spot a few of them flying in and out. And you can often see them flying from under the bridge over to one of the shorelines, either on the island or on the Arlington side, to get mouthfuls of mud to come back and keep making their nest. So again, taking advantage of these areas. I'm not going to talk a lot about waterfowl except right now, but there are some waterfowl that do really good in some urban areas. Mallards are really common. They're not a picky eater. They're not a picky nester. If you've ever seen mallards nest, they nest in some really odd and unfortunate areas. But mallards do really well in urban areas too if there's a little bit of water. And so they're pretty common to see. But these guys are a little more strict because obviously they're looking for some kind of water. And you'll get things like great blue herons and other birds as well in even in urban areas, as long as there's a good source of water. One of the other things that's really neat though about mallards is you can often spot some really odd hybrids where they've hybridized with typically like domestic ducks. And so the two on the top here, these were over by National Harbor, I think earlier this year. Both mallards, but you can see some very different coloration there. And then this one on the bottom here, also kind of really dark with the green head. This was what I spotted out in Spokane. So it's always kind of fun to keep an eye out for those, just for some really odd or differently colored mallard ducks there. And of course, Canada geese. Canada geese do really well. And when you're in an urban area, if there's not a lot of predators, it's perfect. But as we start to see things like coyotes, in more and more in urban areas, that's not as good a thing for Canada geese. These guys will defend their nests vigorously against most critters, even small foxes or raccoons. But if you have a coyote coming in the nest, the geese are probably thinking, well, we can lay some more eggs. It's just not something that the geese are going to stick around for. It's pretty dangerous for them. They'll pitch a fit and make a noise, but they're not going to stay and try to fight that coyote. But generally, we've got these nice, in the back here, you can see this nice mowed area. The geese love the grass. In urban areas where you also often have thermal island where it stays warmer than the surrounding areas. If you've got less snow cover, then there's more food to eat. And even these birds that spend a lot of time in water. I've talked about this in some of my other bird programs. They have a counter current system of circulation in their legs. So even though those legs of the geese are bare, they're not covered with insulating feathers. When the blood comes out from the body to feed the legs with oxygen and nutrients, as it's coming out of the main part of the goose's body, that artery is passing or is right next to the vein of the blood that's coming back, the deoxygenated blood that's coming back from the feet. And the warmth from the outgoing blood warms the incoming blood. And at every point along that where those two are next to each other, the blood coming back from the toes is always cooler than the blood coming out from the body. And so you have a near, I wouldn't say near perfect, but a very highly efficient system for conserving that heat. So they lose very little heat through their legs, because as that heat comes out, that warm blood comes out, it's actually warming the blood going back into the body. And so that's how, if you've ever seen a duck or a goose standing on ice, you're like, how can they do that? Oh, it's one of the ways they can do it, is because of that counter current circulation system. This is City Park in Denver. I just want to point out, sometimes you can find really neat areas and a really neat spot in an urban area if you have people that have done a nice job of planning in your urban area to allow for green space and allow for open space. And you can see this is, there's a lot of buildings, a lot of homes surrounding here, but you got this nice square of relatively non-urban, a little more friendly to wildlife area. There's a golf course, okay? So it's definitely used a lot by people. There's the zoo there, but you can see this bigger lake's called Fair Lake. The smaller lake, if I remember correctly, is called Duck Lake. There's a museum over here on the right. This is Duck Lake, and this is the island in Duck Lake. And this has the fourth largest cormorant rookery in the state. Um, Colorado does not have a lot of natural lakes, but they have a ton of human-made lakes, as reservoirs, and so they get their fair share of um, waterfowl. There's a lot of pelicans out there, surprisingly. But this lake here, you get great blue herons, you get black crowned night herons, and again, you've got all these cormorants nesting here, and so it's a really, really good spot. Um, I actually found that information out that this is the fourth biggest rookery in the state on a paper that was talking about all the difficulty it is. You can see all the green growth here, all the difficulty they have with maintaining the water quality here because you've got so many birds essentially defecating in it constantly, and it really messes with the water quality in this park. So let's talk about some urban birds here, specifically some of the critters. We're going to start with Peregrine Falcon. If you happen to get my email that I sent out to Armin, where I was trying to push this a little bit, yeah, I mentioned trash birds and uh, what was the other word I used? Oh, flying rats, because I've heard both birders and non-birders um, referred disparagingly to pigeons, to starlings, to sparrows, in means like that. This is one of the few urban birds that I don't think people have a lot of bad things to say about it. It's a very charismatic species. It's a beautiful, beautiful uh, bird. Peregrine's had a really hard time of it. In fact, let's go to yeah, I got the abundance map here. Peregrine's had a really hard time of it as new pesticides were used. They go into the bugs, and if the bugs didn't get killed before they were eaten by birds or mammals. And then you have the peregrine, which pretty much specializes more on birds. But in general, they're eating smaller animals that were eating all these bugs, and so that those pesticides could accumulate in those tissues and then get magnified in the tissues of the peregrine. This is called bioaccumulation, and that was really bad news for the peregrine. And then you had DDT, which was another pesticide that was out there that people were using, and that DDT was something that was causing their eggs to break, and so you'd have these falcons trying multiple times to um, have a mate and have young, and constantly have the eggshells failing because they were so thin that they would get crushed, and the youngsters wouldn't survive. So their numbers really plummeted early in the last century. But as we started to see some control of pesticide use and some changes in or just outright banning in the use of DDT, their numbers rebounded. And you saw that with osprey and bald eagle as well. But out west, they tended to fare a little better, but they were almost all but extinct in the east. And there have been introductions in different places. Again, when I worked in Cleveland, there was a pair that nested on the terminal tower in Cleveland, and they had a camera on them and everything. That was a really big deal. And so everybody knew them and knew their name. One of the good places to see these birds around here is at Gravelly Point, which is the park on the just north of National Airport. There's a bridge. If you're out there on Gravelly Point, if you're out near the river and you look upriver, you can see there's a bridge going off. That's another spot to see them pretty well. I try not to look because I'm the one usually driving over that bridge, so it's not a safe way to spot them. But I've seen them over there before. It's a pretty good spot to catch them. And there are some areas around here where you can see them. When I was working in Reston, they had a pair that had showed up and started using one of the large buildings in downtown Reston. So it's always pretty exciting. And oh, yep, sorry, there was a closer view. We're looking at that big one. And again, I got a lot of these charts from eBird. I want to make sure everybody understands these are from eBird. You can access them and use them as well. But I want to make sure that obviously, they did the work on this, that they get the credit. And you can see again, out west, up, and further up north, there's a pretty good abundance there. But in the east, there's still small numbers, but you can see them in a lot of, you can see the abundance numbers are up in a lot of urban areas. There's Cleveland. Here's our region right here. So it is nice to see them back. It's pretty nice, pretty exciting. And again, they are fast. This is the fastest animal in the world. They can hit speeds of, I've read upward of 240 miles per hour when they're diving after their prey.
Oh my
Um,
gosh.
yeah, it's a pretty good one there. Careful with the microphone, but yeah, it's a pretty good one. The fastest powered flight is a bird called, oh, I just looked it up before this and I still forgot. It's a bird from another area, and they can hit speeds of over 170 while flying, and that's powered flight. What I'm talking about when this peregrine is doing this, it's a dive. They're going to a dive, they're tucking their wings in against themselves, and it look like a little torpedo flying through the air, and they punch birds right out of the sky. And they have a strong beak for snapping. One of their ways of dispatching their prey is to bite them on the back of the neck and break the vertebrae, and to kill the birds. But they will go after waterfowl and pigeons. I think are two of their most prevalent prey. Yeah, there's a picture of one feeding off of a common teal. Um, and that's how they catch it. Sometimes they'll catch the bird while it's still tumbling in midair, but that's how they get their food. And so they're pretty much a hunter for the most part of other birds. And you can see they're pretty inspiring. This is a nice little Valentine. One of my favorite is comics is Bird and Moon, because she does a good job of, I think, being funny, but also being still pretty educational. Um, and yeah, I like that in the bottom left there, that dramatic midair explosion of feathers. That's really what you see. I've always wanted to see one, and I've never quite had the opportunity to see one successfully hunt. Um, I will say, if you've ever seen a pigeon flock fly up and they all go in one direction, and all of a sudden, boom, they all turn and go in another direction, and boom, they all turn and go in another direction, start looking around for the bird that disturbed them, because that's very typical predator evasion, a technique where they're all going in one direction, then the other, and then the other. If you saw Jurassic Park, they talk about that in with one of the groups of dinosaurs that's running. They're like, oh, that's really classic predator, and the Tyrannosaurus comes out. And spoilers, but it's been 30 years, so hopefully you've seen the movie if you wanted to by now. Um, but that's really how it goes. And so the first time I actually saw a peregrine falcon that I remember, it was that I was watching this um, flock of pigeons just go back and forth. And I was like, why are they doing it? And I remember thinking, oh, I just had that thought and look around. And sure enough, I actually spotted the pair. He didn't get lucky. And like I said, I've always wanted to see one successfully catch its prey, but I've never had. Been fortunate to see several, but I've never seen that there. And as I mentioned, Terminal Tower is one of the most watched pairs of peregrine I've ever seen. They had cameras up there on the nest and on the buildings to capture them, and they got some really neat shots of the peregrines in flight, heading in and out, and feeding their youngsters. If you can find a video or images of the people that would go in from ODNR, which is the Ohio Department of Natural Resources, to pull the chicks out and measure them and take measurements to keep an eye out. They go in with hard hats because these birds can hit really hard, and they're not, they didn't take too kindly to people catching taking their youngsters to measure them. But they would just nest on, like, see this building back here? You see there's a little ledge? That's what they would nest on. They typically nest on, bare cliffs. And every one of those buildings that has a ledge looks like a bare cliff. And I remember one year meeting somebody who had been in the office that was right next to that. And, for a year, they got to watch these birds come in and out with the chicks. And I would have never gotten any work done. It would have been fantastic. But since we talked about the predator, let's talk about the prey. This is the rock pigeon. I could probably do an entire program on the rock pigeon, and I don't feel like I'm going to talk nearly about them enough as much as I could or should. But maybe someday we'll get around to that. But pigeons are one of those birds that I think have that rep for being not too bright, and they're actually pretty good survivors and pretty impressive. They are found mostly around the world. There's a lot of pigeon aficionados who used to, people that would raise them, they would eat them. Squab was really a popular food until other things like chicken became more available. But you raise these birds, and sometimes you ate them, sometimes you raced them, sometimes you use them to send messages. And a lot of the ways that we use them, we don't now, and so they're not as in vogue as maybe as they once were. Um, I have a book I'll show you at the end of the talk that want to share with you if you're more interested in pigeons. But in it, there's a quote from Charles Darwin, who says, "I will show you my pigeons, which is the greatest treat, in my opinion, which can be offered to a human being." And I thought that was fabulous. Some interesting quotes. I like Darwin, but I found some interesting quotes ascribed to him. And that was one of them. He really liked his pigeons. He also liked his barnacles, but that's definitely a story for another time. The other member of the family that you'll find around here is the mourning dove. Mourning doves are the bird that's always going to fake you out, and you think you're listening to an owl, and you're really hearing the mourning dove, that hoo hoo. They do that cooing. In North America, there are oh, yeah, 14 species of doves in 6 genera that occur naturally. There's 312 species around the world. So there are quite a few species of dove. Rock doves, as I mentioned, or rock pigeons, or just pigeon, are pretty common, but you'll see that genetic diversity here. And typically you've got birds that are rock pigeons that are feral, and you can constantly have people escapes from captivity. So you'll get some birds that have been bred for certain colors or certain breeds, and you'll see that out and about. So you'll see a group of birds, and they're all pigeons, but there's a lot of diversity there, and you can see some really interesting coloration within these. Um, the majority of these pigeons I'm showing you here, I believe, were all taken at Gravelly Point. If somebody wanted to look at pigeons, that would be one of the places I'd be like, you can go to you go Gravelly Point, you can get a really good look at pigeons, you get a really good look at gulls. You can see your two different kinds of crows typically there. It's a really good spot for urban birds. All these starlings there. So it's a good spot. But again, you can see lots of diversity. The one thing that's really neat about pigeons is they have a pretty big crop, and what they can actually do, the crop is this part of their digestive tract right here. What they can do is they can go out there and they can just cram food in their crop. So when you see them all, they're pecking and they're pecking. They're not eating necessarily right now. They're picking up seeds and other things that they want to eat, and it's going in their crop, and then they're going to hold it for later. And so they have the ability to gather a large amount of food in a short amount of time, and avoid predation that way. So that's really, really important for living in an urban area. I cut and copied this from another presentation, because what I was talking about in that presentation is generally birds will eat food and it passes through really, really quickly, because they don't want to be weighed down, because one of the most important things they can do is fly. That's a lot of times that's their main means of evading predators. And so they don't last very long. So filling up the crop really quickly can be helpful, but you don't want to fill up too full, and then you're going to have a harder time flying or getting out of there. Pigeons will mate just about any time of the year as long as there's food available. I think winter is probably the least likely time they'll do it, but they could. And because again they are so ubiquitous, hope I'm saying that right, because they are so cosmopolitan in their distribution. We can find them just about everywhere that there are humans around the world. Their activities and their behaviors are really easy to spot. So if you see a bird like this all puffed up and strutting behind a bird like this that looks completely uninterested, that's the male trying to get the female to notice them. um, One of the things that I read is that rarely does she react to the first couple struts here. And so when you see a male and he's constantly doing this, he knows he's not going to get, he knows he's going to get rejected right away, and he just keeps on fluffing and strutting. And it's pretty passive. It's annoying, but he's not. There's no kind of physical contact. He's just constantly doing this fluffing and strutting. I watched this guy work for about 10 minutes with this female. This is down in Ocean City, and I think eventually um, she moved. I don't even think he gave up. He was still willing to keep strutting and fluffing, but it just wasn't happening for him. And one of the things that's really, really neat about pigeons is they will produce a type of milk from the lining of that crop. So let me go back here real quick without flashing too many images at you. But the lining of the crop will start producing something called pigeon's milk. And then when they have youngsters, the youngsters can go into the parent's mouth, and they can regurgitate that milk for the youngsters to drink, and it's highly nutritious. And the males can actually do this too. Both the male and the female will begin to produce this as the eggs get ready to hatch. And for about a week, this is all that the young pigeons will eat, and so the adults don't actually feed during that time. So hopefully they've really fed up as much as they can. And again, as I mentioned earlier, using an area that the best you can. This to me looks like some rectangular kind of planter, and these pigeons just made their nursery home in there. And then by the end of the second week, they're still feeding some crop milk to the youngsters, but they're also mixing in seeds and berries and bugs and other things that they can catch. So they're starting to turn them on to regular food as well. And pigeons can fledge pretty quickly. I think sometimes within 30 days they can be fledged and flying around with the parents. Gulls. My public service announcement to all of you is there is no such thing as a seagull. There's many different kinds of gulls, but the actual term seagull is not, there's not an actual species named by that. Um, and I'm trying to say that gently because there are some birders that will not say that gently. Probably one of the most common we'll have around here during the part of the year where they're really around here are ring-billed gulls. You can see that little black ring on the bill there, so they come by their name honestly. And again, this picture is from Gravelly Point. The gulls there are they'll fly away. Like you can't walk up and swat one, or grab one. But they're gonna let you get closer than most other birds were before they're like, all right, I don't like this. So again, if you want to observe gulls, it's a really good spot. A couple of other gulls that you'll see around here, these are both larger than the ringbill. This is the herring gull. You can see there's no ring, but there is a red spot on the bill. And this is a great blackback gull. See the black back. They're also large, similar in size to the herring gull. Both really big birds. This is one you don't see as often, but you do see them fairly regularly. If you see a large gull with a black back, white belly, it's a pretty good chance that that is a great blackback gull. And in case you're wondering, there is a lesser blackback gull. But that one's definitely not as common around here. So these are kind of, I think, three of the gulls you'll see more often. There's another species I'll show you in a little bit. That red spot there is where the youngsters peck. And it helps trigger the adult to regurgitate the food that they have to give to the youngsters. And so, excuse me, I gotta tell you, as a human, looking at it through a human lens, having a very visible area where somebody can make you regurgitate just does not seem like a positive. But in the bird world, I guess it works out okay. Trying to remember. Yeah, I want to say this here before I move on. Um, One of the things that's really interesting is gulls will eat trash. They'll eat, out of dumps. They'll eat out of trash cans. They'll eat food that gets left behind by people. They will eat McDonald's French fries like most of these other birds. Then when we talk about some of these urban birds, not very nutritious or really good food for them. When they're, oh, I am going to say this later. So that's what they'll eat, and I'm going to talk about what they'll feed their youngsters later. I just remembered I do have that slide later on. One of the things I want to point out, a lot of times on a lot of these birds, you'll see the tips of their wings tend to be dark. Okay, and that dark comes from pigments like melanin, and those pigments help to strengthen feathers. And so that's no coincidence that a lot of times on the tips of these feathers, you will see that they're dark, and that the tips of these feathers, especially on these outer wing feathers, which are really exposed to abrasion and the elements, will wear down quickly. And so having dark feather tips like that means that those feather tips are strengthened and they're less likely to break down. So you might find, like if we look down here and you saw these wings, you might find that this white portion has worn away tremendously if those feathers are molted, but those dark ones will still be pretty much intact. And so dark feather tips like that really help those feathers stay in good condition. These are some laughing gulls, which we also get. And again, we have some gulls that move in and out at different times of the year. This picture is taken, is not taken around here. This is down in Texas. But this is typically what you would see of gulls if there was some really stormy weather. They're pretty stoic. They'll kind of just stand here. They will angle themselves to face the wind. I think this was a breezy day, and that's why they're all looking in the same direction. And they may bow their head a little bit. And they're streamlining themselves to let the wind and the air go over. Typically what gulls do, they can sense changes in barometric pressure. So if they sense that a storm is coming, they'll try to eat a little extra food so that then they can sit like this, weather that storm, and live and just survive with the food that they already have in their gut until the inclement weather passes and they can move on. So they don't go anywhere really special. They're just kind of hanging out there. Um, And as I mentioned earlier, adult gulls will eat a lot of things that just don't seem like they have a lot of nutritional content. But when they're feeding their young, they really focus on small fish, crabs, and other crustaceans, and make sure that they're getting the good stuff for their youngsters, so they have highly nutritious meals as they grow, which I thought is very can be very human. Like I've met some people where I'm like, you're eating that, but their kids are eating fruits and vegetables and really good food. And these birds do some of those same things. And it's again, gulls tend to be more closer to water, but if you've got a really good garbage dump, you're going to find a lot of gulls there as well. They're going to take advantage of that food area. And around here we have some really good areas for gulls. Again, Gravelly Point, Roach's Run, you'll see gulls there. Outside of Arlington, anywhere along the Potomac, where you can get out and look around places like Dyke Marsh, a lot of gulls. If you get away from that river though, like if you go somewhere like Huntley where there's a big marsh, don't seem to see a lot of gulls in there. Other gulls tend to stay more to these bigger bodies of water where there's a lot of fish, but they'll go after a lot of other human sources of food as well. House sparrow. I think this is one of those birds that can really engender some both positive and negative feelings in people. This is the first bird I can remember having the first memory of any kind of wild bird, and it's feeding McDonald's fries to house sparrows because I was a big McDonald's fan as a kid, and I remember we'd pop off little ends of the French fries and toss them out and watch the sparrows eat them, and I just thought that was the greatest thing ever. Um, and so house sparrows are non-native. They're not from around here, just like the pigeon is non-native. Talking about the gulls; those are pretty native. But house sparrows are something that you'll see just about anywhere that people are. They have there's evidence that house sparrows have been following people for food, human populations, not, just we're handing it out, but following people and their messiness for food for, well over 10,000 years. And so wherever people have gone, so have the house sparrows, up until, as late as the 1800s, when we were carting things around on grain and other food stores around on big carts that were drawn by horses, where sometimes things would fall off. There were the house sparrows to take care of that. They have a really big bill. That really big bill helps them to eat hard grain and other kinds of food that they'll find around people. And that always makes me think of the Darwin finches from the Galapagos, and they're different bills, and you got the bigger bills for seed eaters and smaller bills for insect eaters. And I feel like sometimes sparrows will go after the bugs as well. These house sparrows, I want to make sure I'm saying that they're actually let's go back to the family here. I think they're more closely related to finches than they are to a lot of the other more wild sparrows that we'll talk about. Um, but talking about their bill and how big it is to eat seeds, that always reminds me a little bit of the Darwin finches. They are very aggressive at trying to go after cavities to nest in. As anybody who is either a purple martin aficionado, like this box right here, or a bluebird aficionado knows, house sparrows can be very detrimental to any kind of efforts to providing food, shelter for these kinds of critters. And then European starlings, as long as we're talking about introduced species, is another one that was introduced. There's a story that I think turns out to be apocryphal, that there was a person who wanted to make sure all of the birds in Shakespeare's plays were found in Central Park, or in North America. And there's no proof that that was the intent, but there is proof that a gentleman who was in the American Acclimatization Society, if I remember correctly, was responsible for not one, not two, but three releases of European starlings in Central Park, and the third one took. I think they released like 60 individuals of European starlings. And now we have over, I think, like 15 million, maybe it's 150 million. We have a ridiculous amount of starlings on the continent, and it can all be traced back to that original release there. That was a society that was into releasing things from where people had come from, so they could make them feel more at home. And there are people there are others in science who look back at that and think that that is one of the worst things that we have to deal with now with some of our problems in natural areas and managing them, especially with invasive species. It can trace a lot of those problems directly back to these societies that were thinking they were doing something good and were in fact really wreaking havoc on our natural ecosystems here in North America. Um, and the European starling, one of the things you'll notice about them, as I mentioned, it's not as spotty as the house sparrow or the pigeon, and they've got an advantage over those other two birds and even some native birds, and that is that they are able to stick their bill into the ground and then open it while it's in there. So they're actually very tactile. They can feel around and find insects and invertebrates and other critters in there to eat. And you'll often find them active in areas where other insect-eating birds have already left or aren't active year-round. And they have this advantage again because they're able to poke and probe. And that's one of the reasons they've been so successful in both urban and some other natural areas in North America and around the world. I'm approaching 8 o'clock here, so I'm zipping through these guys a little bit here at the end. Crows. I don't think you can talk about urban areas without, acknowledging crows, which do very well, which are native, do very well in some of our natural forests and field areas, but also do pretty well in urban areas as well. Around here, we have two kinds of crows. You'll find the American crow and the fish crow. And if you're looking at those pictures and you think you can tell the difference, probably not. The best way to tell the difference between them is by their call, which is one of my favorite dad jokes. Because American crows say, "Ah, ah," and then fish crows have a more nasally, eh. And so what you do when you find a crow to figure out if it's a fish crow or an American crow is you ask it, "Are you an American crow?" And if it says, then you know it's a fish crow. Thank you. I'll be here all week. Try the veal. So that's how you tell the difference. I've met some birders who insist that they can tell the difference, but there's so much overlap in the size that really your best bet to identify them is by call. I highly doubt. I want to give them that credit, but I really highly doubt that anybody would be 100% at identifying one versus the other for just by their appearance. Now, a couple of other urban corvids you might find around here, a common raven. We had some ravens nesting on a GW bridge over Pimmet Run, just north of Gulf Branch this year, which is really neat. And blue jays. Blue jays, I think, are easy to tell the difference between them and the other corvids we'll have around here, the two crows and the raven. Ravens are much bigger. I've always, I'll look at a crow and be like, oh, is that big enough to be a raven? And then you'll see a raven and you just, oh, yeah, no, definitely it wasn't. They have a much larger bill. Hopefully you can see just that proportion of that bill even against the crow on my little sidebar here. It's just a much bigger bill, and it's a much bigger bird. There are a couple of really good ways to tell the difference. The little rougher throat feathers on the raven versus the crow, which is much more smooth. In flight, that wedge-shaped tail is very diagnostic. It's really easy to spot, and it's a great way to tell the difference between the two. And again, calls. You got the from the American crow or the from the fish crow, and then you got the raven, which has a croak. And I've several times been able to list a raven on my bird list without even seeing them because you can just hear that and it's pretty obvious. And we can skip the little barrel roll punchline at the end there unless you hopefully maybe you've already read that. But that was just a little bit of fun. Again, this is a really good comic strip if you're a nature enthusiast. This is the Tamaulipas crow, which you will not find around here. It's one of the rarest and hardest to find birds north of Mexico because there's only really one spot to find it north of Mexico, and that is the dump in Brownsville, Texas. As I mentioned, there are a lot of critters that can do a pretty good job here. You can see these black-headed gulls down here, I think are laughing gulls. And here's a large gull, which I'm not familiar with the birds in Texas, so I can't tell. But you can see tons and tons of gulls here. And I don't know if this is a crow or a bird of prey, but there's a darker bird here. But this is the area where lots of birders go to try to get that crow because it's one of the few places in North America where you can find it. It's just I think it's more common in Mexico, but if you're not willing to go to Mexico looking for it, this is about where you go. And Brownsville is like way down in the southern tip of the state there. And I think this is the last part I'm gonna finish up with, and this is one of my favorites. These are Chimney Swift. They look like a cigar with wings. They're very fast. I've had many people describe bats that they saw during the day and turned out to be these guys. They have a nice little chitter, which you can hear even if they're flying above the canopy of the woods and you're out there hiking around. You can hear them even through that, so it's easy to get them to add them to your bird list, which if you haven't been able to tell yet, for me is really important. They are insect eaters, and so they're migratory, and they do go down into southern Texas and into Central and even South America from eastern North America. Let's zoom in a little bit on that abundance map. And you'll see, just like some of the other birds, they have a pretty good distribution around here. But you can see some of these dark spots. This is the Cleveland area here. The DC area. There's a pretty deep dark spot there. In some of these areas, this is Boston here in the eastern end of Massachusetts here. So you can see they have these dark areas where they have they really congregate or tend to mass in more urban areas. For chimney swifts, it's because they prefer roosting or nesting in hollowed out trees. And there's not as many of those around as there are chimneys, which is where they get their name from. And so now, it's thought that they are almost exclusively nesting in these structures in human areas, which would be great, except we've moved on from a manufacturing economy to more of a service economy. And so it's great in that a lot of those chimneys aren't being used. So it's probably healthier for their lungs and their breathing. But it also means that some of the time, a lot of times you get these factories that are going to knock down and cleared out for other things. And so they're losing those spaces. I do a program every year over at Walter Reed, and we walk back into the residences behind Walter Reed on the one street there, and there's a chimney there, and they use it pretty regularly every year. I live in Annandale, and just down the road on Gallows Road on the outside of the Beltway is Luther Jackson Middle School, and there's a chimney there that they're chimney swifts use regularly. There's several in the area. I remember seeing another chimney that was used in Alexandria when I was out there once for dinner somewhere in Old Town. So they're around and they do really, really well. And you get hundreds of birds that end up in these chimneys. Their feet are modified so they can hang on vertical surfaces. If you look at their tail, you can see their feathers end in spines, and they can lean back against those spines when resting. They have really, really long wings. Hopefully you can see my cursor. Their wing bones are actually really short, and it helps them with their flying. And if you see them in flight, they look like little bats. They have really, really fast and rapid wing beats. This is a fantastic picture I found on NPS that really shows the features, because it's tough to get a good picture of these guys. And they have some really neat feathers around their mouth that help them feel and detect the insects and other invertebrates that they're catching in the air there. They do everything on the wing. All these little dark specks here that looks, again, like I said, feel like they often look like bats. This is a really far distant picture, and I feel like you should still be able to see it. You can see there's a splash there and a couple splashes here. They're taking baths, they're taking drinks, and they're cleaning themselves on the wing. They don't perch, because their feet are modified for hanging on vertical surfaces. They literally cannot and do not perch. And so even to make things like a nest, they will, and I'm hoping that this person who drew this was not drawing one as it was roosting. They will actually break off sticks in flight to gather for their nests. Right before they start they get ready to lay eggs, their salivary glands increase tremendously, and they produce a sticky saliva that they use essentially as the glue to stick all these sticks together in this nest, which looks like half of a cup on a vertical surface. It's really, really impressive nest building. So these birds have taken advantage of urban areas and these structures that we've built, and you find them almost exclusively nesting there now. And then when they move through for migration, they might be in flocks that are number in the hundreds or thousands that roost in these chimneys before moving on as they go through their migrations. So again, um, so many birds that people might consider urban. There's so many birds that could we could have talked about. I just wanted to again really drive home the point. There's a lot of birds that can use our areas because they can fly away, because they're really intelligent, because they're opportunistic in what they find and eat. They're really smart and figure out how to find things to eat in our areas, and they can use our urban environments to their advantage as well. So what's sad is it's really easy to find um, some stories about birds that are disappearing or birds that aren't doing really well. We have a lot of birds that are doing really well in urban areas, but we don't always value them. And I wanted to do this and hopefully give you all an idea of just some of the neat things that these birds do and how much better we can appreciate them. Because yeah, they can be annoying and yeah, they can poop on your car or poop on you. You know, I've seen it happen. But they do have some really interesting life histories and some really interesting adaptations of things they do, and hopefully they can be appreciated for those as well. I feel like I'm standing on a soapbox, so I'll say thank you. I'm going to check the chat real quick and see if there are any questions. Oh, I don't see any questions. But if anybody has any questions, now would be the great time to ask me.
Hey Ken, I
Yes,
had one quick question.
Sure.
Going, maybe just to me. I was wondering about grackles and where they fit in the starlings, corvids. Are they?
Okay. Neither.
Yeah.
So they're icterids, and that's the blackbird family. So they're in with red-winged blackbirds and orioles. They're in those groups. Neat thing about grackles, because I'm doing a acorn programs for 3 to 5 year olds. And I try not to go too much into this because they're younger, but they have a keel on the roof of their mouth, and so they can exploit acorns because they can put the acorns in their mouth and break them in half with that keel. So they're really good at doing that. Everybody eats acorns. Yeah,
Oh.
but grackles are grackles are one of the other birds I remember from my youth because my grandfather hated them. He just thought they were mean birds, and he had a bird bath, and they were always chasing the other birds out. Excuse me, but yeah, grackles are really neat birds. They're pretty, and they do a really good job in of using urban areas as well.
And one other question: what was the name of the comic strip that you shared a couple slides of?
It's called Bird and Moon. You can find it on Facebook, or you can just look up Bird and Moon comics. It'll come up. She is also, and I want to throw this out, just released a new book called Pigeon Watching. Her name is Rosemary Moscow. It's a pocket guide to pigeon watching. And if you don't get it or if you don't remember, email me and I'll gladly send you a link to it. It's a delightful book. She takes the time, even though they look like such simple illustrations, she takes the time to get the field marks right. So she does some really good stuff. Thank you for saying that because I almost forgot. There's a great book out called A Field Guide to Urban Wildlife, which is just all urban wildlife in general, which is really good. I will say sometimes you run into difficulties with generalists. I think the book is really neat. It's got some interesting stuff about all kinds of critters. They happen to mention that there's 2,200 species of birds north of Mexico, and that is not correct. I think it's more generally accepted that there's 700, but there's a lot of in and outs. So maybe they were including Mexico. And two books I used a lot for this. Sibley, I think is an amazing author. It's my field guide of choice. I have the app on my phone, but he also has the Sibley Guide to Bird Life and Behavior, which has a few pages on each of the families, and it was really, really good. And if that seems too dense for you, I highly recommend my birthday present, What It's Like to Be a Bird, also by David Allen Sibley, which is just fascinating. It's chock full of great facts, and it's not dry at all. There's a little paragraph about something, and he's like, and you might like what's on page 34 if you thought this was interesting. There's several really good books out there. It's a really good time to like birds because there's a lot of really good information out there that people can check out and use. So
Do grackles and starlings, do they flock together, or do they compete with each other, or do they complement each other, or what?
I don't know. I think that a lot of times you get mixed flocks of blackbirds. You might get some grackles in. I think you're also likely to see some more um, uh, red-winged blackbirds in there as well. But I don't know that they're super competitive. I've seen again, I keep talking about Gravelly Point because it's just one of those areas where you get a lot of these birds. And I've seen both grackles and starlings in there, and I've never seen any conflict between them. I think they do okay. But they're both, using similar sources of food, both insects and seeds.
They also do they nest in the same areas?
I can't speak to, I believe starlings can be cavity nesters. I can't speak to where grackles nest, though. I'm not entirely sure of that one.
Yeah, it's really hard to tell for me to tell apart, when I look at them from a
Oh,
distance.
what's that?
Yeah, it's really hard for me to tell them apart when I look at them.
Oh, okay. Well, starlings tend to have a more mottled appearance. They can be luminescent green and purple, but they tend to have those little like whitish spots around them, which I think is part of how they got the name Starling, because it looks like stars. That's how I always remember. But grackles are, they're jet black, but they can also, you can see blue and green and even purple iridescence on them if you get them in the right right light.
Yeah, that's the trouble with Starling. Sometimes I think they do anyway, have the iridescence, I think.
Grackles have, I don't have a bird book here with me. I feel like grackles have a more brightly, like a lighter, like yellow or whitish eye, and I don't feel like you get that with the starlings. I feel like their eye is very dark.
It's, I think close to them, yeah.
So yeah, yeah, they don't let you get close for some reason. I don't get it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Anybody else have any questions I can help with? I like that everybody's still here. It feels pretty good. Well, then I'm gonna say thank you. I appreciate y'all coming out. I was looking at the list and there's a lot of new names I didn't recognize, so I appreciate you giving this a try. And there are a lot of names I do recognize, and I wish we were doing this in person because there's some people I haven't seen in a long time. But thanks for coming out tonight. I always appreciate and feel thankful that you've chosen to spend the evening with me. Um, but as it was, I sadly need to bid you adieu. I'm gonna let y'all go, and I'm gonna go put my daughter to bed. Although I see someone's typing, so I'm gonna hang out for this message. Oh, you're welcome, Jerry. Thanks for coming. It's good seeing you again.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome, Teresa. All right. Well, thank
Thank
you all.
you.
Y'all have a good night. I'm gonna go ahead and end this, and then I will talk to you later. Oh, what am I doing next month? I think I'm doing timing of seasons next month. And I've got another weird mating rituals in February. I think it's two is not enough. It's like like I did dying for love and finding love and by yourself love, and I figured, well, let's do group love. So that's going to be February. I said it a little more professional in the write up. I can't remember what I'm doing in January though. It's not coming off the top of my head, but we got a couple more, and then Maddie's doing one that looks really interesting, where she's talking about the origins of all the different spices that are, well, what people consider traditional for the holidays. So that one's coming up in early December too, and I might go to that one because that one sounds really cool. So I want to make sure I throw those out there. So thanks again, everybody, and y'all have a good one. And I'm gonna go ahead and say goodbye.
All right, bye. Good night.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.